chapter 14 and start chapter 15. I'm getting my classes muddled up because we're on the same chapter number in both classes. Yes, we're going to finish chapter 14 and start chapter 15. And tomorrow is the student research day, so there aren't any classes. So we don't need to dial in to lab or anything like that because we don't have class tomorrow. And so then I will see you again on Thursday. Okay. All right, any questions on the chapter 14 information before I continue? Okay, so we were looking at the idea of perception action loops. And so now we're going to look at postural control, which involves a lot of sensory information that the brain uses to help keep us on balance. So we've got pressure receptors in the bottom of our feet, for example. We have our Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles, and then we have joint receptors in the ankles. So lots and lots of information, visual information, auditory information coming into the brain that it uses to help us maintain postural control. All right, so when we're looking at balance in particular, we have another sensory organ in the inner ear called the vestibular organ, and that is responsible for telling the brain, so it has three sections to it. So it's a little bit like if you've done any math stuff with 3D, it's a bit like an X, Y, Z setup. So it can tell the brain if you're tilting, it can tell the brain if you're turning around that way. It can also tell the brain if you're rolling forwards or backwards, right? So very important for posture. And we have to think about the fact that we don't just have to maintain our posture when we're standing still, right? We also have to be able to maintain our posture in a dynamic situation. And we may have to balance on other parts of our body, not just our feet, and on different surfaces that might not be stable, okay? And so we've got specific environmental and task constraints that interact with postural control, and we see that balance is very specific. Just because I'm good at balancing in a stationary situation doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be good at balancing in a dynamic situation. So between about the age of 3 up until 18, 19, we see some improvement in balance, although some of the literature is a little equivocal because it depends on what tasks you're looking at, okay? It's very task specific. So if I'm doing a stalk stand, for example, as a balance assessment, that's not the same kind of balance that I need to land having gone over a hurdle to land on one leg and keep running. All right, so those are two different forms of balance. And the kind of variability that we see when we watch younger children playing with their balance, so you've seen a lot of that on the video from the playground, because I often will put out an obstacle course with lots of balance things on it, and I also had the other week the stability pads and the wibble wobble board. So you've seen some of that. From a dynamic systems point of view, the children, the brain of the children is trying out different combinations of muscle activation, right? So it's got to control this very, very fluid, big hip joint, but it's also got to control knees and ankles, and so we'll see different behaviors as the brain shifts around between different systems trying to get the right combination. Okay. And think about, I think we mentioned this already, you know, if you're sitting in a car or on a plane and the car or plane next to you starts to move, and you get that feeling of, oh, we're leaving the gate, and then you realize you're not leaving the gate, it's the plane next to you that was leaving the gate, but you get some postural sway because you think you're going to move backwards. Right? So the more recent research is looking at the kind of strategies that the children are using to help them maintain their balance, and also looks at how balance strategies change over the lifespan. So remember the little bit of film that I showed you with the moving room? Was that last week? Lost track of time. Right, and we saw the child fall when the room moved forwards or backwards, and then we saw a little clip of an adult balancing in that room, and then when we put him on a complicated task like balancing on that little beam, then it becomes much harder for even adults to maintain their balance, right? So when they're investigating postural control and balance, they use a lot of EMG information. So they'll put little stickers all over and pick up the muscle activation kind of patterns to see, and this is how they can tell that things are changing across the lifespan. All right? And so what they believe is that static balance, one of the reasons that we see differences between static and dynamic is the feedback loops that are used. So static balance uses sensory feedback, so it adjusts based on the information it's getting from the sensory organs, but it appears that dynamic balance uses a feed forward, so we have to prepare the joint and the muscle activation ahead of time, right? So two different mechanisms for the balance type, okay? So think about some surfaces that might make balance difficult for you, or perhaps if you have grandparents, what surfaces would make balance difficult for older individuals? And then what do you do if you trip or you slip? What do you do? Can you visualize or feel what you do to compensate for that? All right? And then think about other surfaces, the orientation of the surface. So if you're running, if you're running the hills, right, on the side of Greyhound Arena, what do you do differently than if you're running laps on the track? Okay, so you've got to try to use our constraints triangle, right? So if I'm running on the track versus running on the hill, okay? So I have a different surface, I have a different orientation, all right? I may have a different goal because the goal when I'm on the track might be to go fast, but the goal on the hill is to get up to the top and down to the bottom without falling over, perhaps, right? So again, think about if I change the constraint, then the interaction means we see a different motor pattern emerge. So what I can watch is different. So do you look the same when you're running the hill? Does your motor pattern look the same as it does when you're running on the track? All right? So all the time when you're reading this information, when you're looking at this, be thinking about, so what changed? Right? If the observable motor skill looks different, what changed to make that happen? Okay? So, with experience, so not a new walker, right? So remember that walking emerges typically on average around the age of 12 months, okay? Anywhere from 8 to 15 would be the range, all right? So what we see with new walkers is that they lose their balance very easily, all right? And go all the way back in the textbook, and remember that kind of ratio perspective diagram that they gave us. Remember that a new walker still has a relatively large head, so it's top heavy, right? And they've got itty bitty little feet that they're trying to balance on, all right? So even in chapter 3, remember, to maintain my balance, I have to keep my center of gravity over my base of support. Well, their base of support is teeny weeny, and they're top heavy, right? So they topple forwards and backwards all the time. Less side to side, because initially when they start walking, they've got that wide foot placement. So side to side, they're relatively stable, but forwards and backwards, very unstable, all right? What we see with experience, so 4 weeks, 6 weeks, is that they can start to take a step and catch themselves before they topple, right? But that takes a lot of practice for the brain, thinking about what information it's getting, how is it maintaining control, which muscles is it turning on to keep the baby upright, okay? So, something else they see with these EMG studies is that at any age, across the lifespan, an individual turns on muscles in anticipation of taking a step, right? So we don't just turn the muscles on as we walk, we have to turn them on ahead of time, right? And the more experience I have at walking or running, the more coordinated those anticipatory muscle activations become. Okay. So I mentioned, I think last week, humans are very visually reliant. Right? We have all this other information bombarding our brain, and yet we pay most attention to the visual stimulus that we're receiving. And that can give us a hiccup every now and then. All right? So One of the studies that is quite popular in a biomechanics lab, so we don't have a biomechanics lab here at Eastern, all right, but in a biomechanics lab, they'll have a balance platform, or they may have a balance walkway, so, and it's got all these sensory pieces, wires and things, so that it can tell where you're pushing on your feet. You get like a map of where the pressure was on your feet. And what they see is that adults your age, right, if I put them on a platform and I move the platform slowly, right, so I'm perturbing your postural control and balance, right? So with adults your age, what we see is that when I do that, they will initiate activation of the muscles around their ankles, right, to regain balance. So if I move this, I turn all these muscles on around my ankles to keep me upright. Okay, you see a big sway, but I don't fall. And if I move the platform very fast or over a bigger area, then we use a hip strategy, right, to keep our balance. Okay, so we use our ankle for a little small perturbation and a hip for a bigger perturbation. So what's interesting about that is what happens as we get older. So when we get to 60 or older than 60, we see much more sway, even when we're standing still. So actually, when we think we're standing still, if I was filming you, we never really stand still. There's always, you know, you think you're standing absolutely still, but actually there's always a tiny little bit of sway going on, okay? With adults over the age of 60, and I'm going to caveat that with the fact that I haven't read the studies, some of them are a bit older, and I don't know whether these adults over 60 were very physically active and therefore kept their strength, or whether this is 60 because you're 60, right? I suspect that if you're 60 and you are very physically active and you maintain your strength, we might not see the same results. But what we see is that it takes someone who's older longer to initiate that muscle contraction in response to being perturbed. So part of that might be because we're starting to lose type 2 muscle fibers, the faster ones, or it takes longer for the motor signal to leave the cortex and get down to the synapse at the neuromuscular junction, okay? So it takes them a little bit longer. So that means that their center of gravity is closer to the edge of their balance than for adults your age, right? So by the time they turn it on, they're much closer to toppling than you would be, okay? Also, what they find is that sometimes they use the back to front strategy. So for a little perturbation, they use a hip strategy, and for a big perturbation, they use an ankle strategy, which obviously is not going to maintain postural control under that situation, right? Or sometimes they'll start to use their knees, right? So we see these different activation patterns as we get older. in order to maintain postural control. Right? So again, think about the triangle. What kind of environmental constraint would put an older adult at risk of toppling but would not present a problem to you? What can you think of? What kind of environmental constraint might cause your grandparents a little more trouble than you? Any ideas? So some of the structural constraints that are going on that might make it harder for older individuals is loss of strength, right? As I said, it's possible that we're seeing a decrease in the type 2 fibers, and our type 1 fibers are strong, but they contract more slowly. So it takes longer to reach a contraction that's going to maintain balance. All right? We could also be seeing changes in the sensory receptors. All right? So they become even more visually dominant because there's some changes in the kinesthetic information from joint receptors, muscle spindles, pressure receptors. So that information is either degraded as it's reaching the brain, or it's just so much slower getting there. And that seems to be particularly so in the sensory receptors that are in the lower legs, and possibly in the vestibular system in the inner ear. All right? It's also, you've got to be, so if you're working with people who have diabetes, all right, one of the things you have to be very careful of with a diabetic population is their balance, all right? Because diabetes causes neuropathy, so it causes degradation of the nerves, and then that slows down information, and so it delays the information, also means that the information is of poor quality when it reaches the central nervous system. And so in diabetics in particular, they tend to develop neuropathy in their lower leg and their feet. So you often will, diabetics often end up developing gangrene and have to lose a lower leg or a foot, right? But before it gets that bad, that information from pressure receptors and things is not very reliable, and so they're much more likely to topple. So if you're working with people with diabetes, you've got to be much more aware of the surface, of their shoes, of the quality of their balance, right? For older individuals, arthritis in the knee or the hip could make a difference. And I already mentioned that the nerve conduction speed, the signal speed, could be much slower. So very happily though, there's been quite a lot of research recently on what happens if we give older individuals balance training. So There are several different programs out there. A couple of them are based on Tai Chi type movements. Tai Chi is excellent for strength because you have your knees slightly bent all the time, and it's very slow, but it's really great for maintaining your balance. And so there's a couple of different balance training programs that are used with elderly populations based on Tai Chi. There's one on yoga, and more of the kind of retirement homes or the I don't know what you call pensioners. You don't call them pensioners over here, but like the community centre for the elderly in town. So they go and they can get food there. They can play cards. It's a place where they can have some social interaction with other people, right? So those kinds of places and residential homes are starting to integrate these balance training programs based on the research that shows that with practice, even older adults can get better, that response to being perturbed can improve. So we want to encourage programs that build stronger legs in particular and help them learn how to maintain their balance, because those are shown in the literature to reduce fall rate, right? And reducing fall rate is very important because falls are the leading cause of death, of accidental death, in adults over the age of 75. Right? So, falling is a big issue as you get older, right? And being aware of the fact that you might fall is a functional constraint, right? That means, okay, now I'm a bit fearful, right? I'm a bit scared. I don't want to fall because I'm not planning on dying anytime soon, right? And in fact, many adults over that 75, something like, I can't remember the percentage, but it's way over 50% of adults who fall do not survive 12 months. Right? So it's a big problem when it comes to motivating people to stay physically active, because their perception is, if I'm physically active, I'm more likely to fall. It's safer to sit in my chair. But the problem is, the more sitting you do, the weaker your legs get, the more likely you are to fall when you stand up. If you can get out of the chair, right? So these are really important programs, and some of you might end up working at a recreation centre. Like we have a recreation centre in town here, right? So for part of the day, when the children are in school and the adults are at work, the only people that are likely to come to the rec centre are people who are retired. So that would be an ideal environment to introduce one of these balance training programs, right? Think about the kinds of equipment that I have on the playground for balance training. Which ones of those, if any, would you use with older adults? Right? Bubble wrap, the big fat bubble wrap, can be a good balance training tool for older adults because it's a little bit bobbly, but it's not so bobbly that it throws them way off. I would not use my stability pads with an older adult. I don't think that is safe. Right? So think about you know, sometimes you have to get creative to introduce certain activities to older adults. Okay. So if we have a biomechanics lab, we can use a force platform to assess balance. We can see what happens if we perturb someone's balance, right? What if we give them conflicting kinesthetic information? And what if we blindfold them and make their brains use alternative sources of sensory feedback, right? Again, if we've got biomechanics lab, we can do EMGs. That gives us a lot of information. But here, we don't have one of those. So what could we set up if we were going to help at the rec center or at the old people's home, right? And that's the end of chapter 14. Questions? Everything okay? Questions? Got in there. Okay, so chapter 14 was based on individual constraints. Chapter 15 is looking at environmental constraints and how those can impact motor development for individuals, right? And some of the ideas might be things you have not really thought very much about, right? So as I said, sociocultural constraints are environmental constraints. So our social environment, our cultural environment can impact our motor development in different ways, right? So the attitudes of the group, so that could be your family, it could be your country, right, can impact motor behavior. And the social values that we have, the atmosphere that surrounds the ideas about moving within that society. What does ideal movement look like? What are stereotypes that are connected with movement that are social and cultural in nature, right? And sometimes they can encourage certain types of movement, and sometimes they can discourage other kinds of movement, right? So we have very culturally specific sports, right? So we looked at the cricket the other day, but there's not much cricket played in America, right? Mostly it's baseball and softball, okay? But in Pakistan, in Australia, in the UK, we don't play baseball and softball, we play cricket, right? Different motor patterns that are encouraged by where I'm living, right? But at the same time, I can say, okay, well, I'm in the UK and my cricket skills are encouraged at school and encouraged in the social context of, especially if I live out in the countryside, of the village or town where I live. You know, I mentioned that typically the cricket green is right by the pub, and so people will go grab a pint, go watch the cricket game, right? It's a very social environment at that level, right? So that's very different, perhaps, to a baseball scenario over here, right? So we're going to be looking at some gender constraints, but also think of, you know, there are race issues, there are religion issues, there's nationality issues, okay? So any of these socio-cultural type of concepts can impact my movement behavior. So the group attitudes, as I said, the group could be the family, the group could be the country, the group could be your peer group, okay? What are the pervasive beliefs about movement within that group, right? And how does that influence what I do or don't choose to do, okay? So, am I encouraged to do socially acceptable movement patterns, or am I discouraged to do movement patterns and certain movement activities, right? So this plays a large role in the motor behaviors that I get to adopt and practice and become good at, right? The choices that I make are highly influenced by this cultural, social, cultural atmosphere that I'm living in, right? So, my socialization within a group has 3 elements to it in this particular model, all right? So the role that I think I play in society has these three elements, right? The first one is socializing agents. So socializing agents can be my family, my peer group, my coaches, my teachers, okay? They play a role, they play an important part in how I think, what I think my role is, right? Social situations involve the types of games that I get to play, the environment that I'm afforded an opportunity to play in, which kind of toys am I given, right? And then always the individual, right? My personal attributes, my personality, right? So how strong am I? What's my motivation to move? Very importantly, what is my perceived ability for movement and certain sports. So if I think I could do it, then I'm going to give it a try. But if I look at something and I go, I don't think I can do that, then I might walk away without even trying to find out whether I can do that, right? My perception of my movement ability can be very, very important. Okay? So learning our role in our society is built on these three elements, right? Significant others, places where socialization can take place, and individual constraints that all feed into this social role, okay? So gender typing is a form of sociocultural constraint, and we gender type all the time in society, and without meaning to necessarily, right? It's not like we go out to deliberately stereotype certain activities. It's just the way things are, kind of, right? It's just, oh. And so it's important to point them out because some of them are very discouraging to movement, and so we want to try to remove those constraints if we can, right? So just some terminology that I get mad at all the time with when I'm listening to the news because they're forever using the wrong term. So sex, male or female, is biological, right? I am 99% of the population are either male or female, okay? That's my sex. Gender is the role that I am taught to play in my group, right? So it's socially determined, okay? Not male or female, but am I a man or a woman, or a boy or a girl? And how does that mean I have to behave, right? So that's not the same thing, and this gender role is learned, right? My sex is genetic. It's what I'm born with. My gender is something we are taught and we learn. Right? So it's very important to be able to differentiate between that, and especially in this day and age, right? The gender role is becoming much more flexible. There's lots of media coverage on individuals who are choosing to change their gender role, right? And the impact that that has on their families or on their jobs, okay? So it's an important talking point right now, okay? So the research would suggest that by the age of 1, so by 12 months, a child has learned or is learning its gender role, all right? And we might question that because they're only 12 months old, okay? But I want you to tell me whose bedroom that is. Boy or girl?
Yes, it's called purple or blue because I can't really tell.
Can you see that, Glory?
Not really. Like I can't tell the color.
Okay, let's try another one. Let's see if we can find one that's more. Okay. Can you tell that one?
Yes. I was saying it's a girl's room.
It's a girl's room, right?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's pink.
Because it's pink. Right. So, if you really step back and think about it, why does pink have to be a girl's colour? Who decided that pink was for a girl? Right? The other bedroom was blue. Okay? So, we can drive past the birthing centre and tell by the colour of the balloons that are hanging outside whether they had a baby boy or a baby girl born today. Right? Why? Right? It's completely abstract. Right? However, those children learn that I'm a boy because I have a blue room, or I'm a girl because I have a pink room. Right? So there's quite a push, and I think it's a good thing, to have gender-neutral colours in a baby's bedroom. Right? Green is a gender-neutral colour. Yellow is mostly gender-neutral. Cream-type colours. Right? Because then you're not dictating your belief system onto that child. Right? So, and then, on top of the pink or blue bedroom, or the action man and the Barbie, right, who gets which, right? On top of that, then we throw in these arbitrary gender roles when it comes to movement behavior and which type of activities are appropriate. Right? So traditionally in the West, sport is appropriate for boys. Now, that's a little old-fashioned, and I would say particularly with the rise of successful girl, female teams, right? So like the women's soccer or the women's gymnastics team, I think that the idea of sport being for boys is gradually getting less important. But we still have sets of sports that we think are more appropriate for one gender or the other, right? So the boys are encouraged to play masculine boy games, right? So they get encouraged to play American football, they get encouraged to join the wrestling team, and then the girls get encouraged to do gymnastics or figure skating because it's pretty and they get to wear sparkly little costumes, right? And then when a girl wants to play American football, there's an uproar, right? So it's very much, as I say, gender typed, right? Field hockey. So do you think field hockey is a masculine or a feminine sport?
Masculine.
Masculine. Okay. in the UK, well, at least when I was growing up in the UK, it would have been a feminine sport because girls got to play field hockey during PE and the boys got to go and play soccer. Right? But again, with the rise of TV and media coverage and the fact that the US men's team is relatively successful. If you were in India or Pakistan, you wouldn't say it was a girls' sport either, right? Because they're very successful on the international stage with their men's teams, right? So why do we care about this? Why does it matter whether boys play American football and girls do gymnastics? All right? The thing is that we are restricting the opportunity to learn other movement patterns when we do this, right? Especially if we do it at a young age. So particularly in something like gymnastics, you know, you go into gymnastics as a preschooler or a kindergartner, and if you're good, then before you know it, you're training 5 or 6 days a week, and there's no opportunity to learn anything else, right? Or take part in anything else. So it restricts these opportunities, and the attitudes are still lingering, right? We're still seeing a problem. We've talked many times, particularly in lab, about the fact that girls lag behind boys, particularly in ball object control type skills, right? And they also drop out of movement opportunities much earlier. They're more sedentary by the time they're 4. If you watch girls versus boys in the park or on the playground, the girls are more sedentary than the boys are, right? So it is a problem because we're funneling this behavior almost, right? We're teaching the girls that girls don't move as much as boys, okay? Or we're teaching the girls that they do gymnastics. I did gymnastics. It was great at the time. Now I'm 57, not so good, right? Because I want to go and play tennis, and I can't hit the flipping ball. Because I didn't do enough. I mean, we did tennis in school, in PE, once a week, for a couple of weeks in the summer, but I was in the gym 6 days a week, right? So I didn't learn how to play tennis, how to catch a ball, how to throw a ball. So it's also the fact that the skill set that we tend to feed the girls into doesn't provide them the foundational skills to be motor competent and engaged in physical activity for the rest of their lifespan, right? But the kinds of skills we teach the boys are much more likely to be used, right? Catch, throw, kick. These are all things I can do when I'm 60 and 70. Okay? Let's see. So Title IX was passed in 72. It's often misunderstood as a law that meant that girls could take part in sport. Actually, it's a law that means the minority can take part in sport. It's just the minority has been girls for so long, right? Girls still drop out of high school sport and PE at much, much higher levels than boys do. You can see the kinds of numbers here. So when we're teaching sports, if we're running the rec centre or we're the PE teacher, how do we introduce gender-neutral sports over sports that are highly gender-orientated? So I would say now, I could be wrong, but I would say from the outside watching that soccer would be considered gender-neutral. Right? And certainly when I'm talking to the children on the playground, to the preschoolers, a lot of the girls go and play soccer. They have like a little soccer league thing in town. And a lot of the girls are playing soccer on the soccer league as well as the boys. Whether or not 4-year-olds should be playing in a soccer league is a whole other conversation to have. But the girls seem to gravitate towards it. So you want to pick things that could be gender neutral, right? If you have a girl say, right, so when I was little I liked to climb trees, okay? So I liked to climb trees, I liked to ride my bike, I did weight training for about 10, right? What's the nickname that I would have got? What would I be called? What do you call a girl that likes to rough and tumble and climb trees? A tomboy, right. So why do I have to be a tomboy? Because I'm a girl who likes to climb trees. Right? So again, you know, we have these arbitrary terms within our language, but they subconsciously are teaching a certain perspective to the boys and to the girls, right? It's one of the reasons why I said make sure when you're buying equipment that you buy lots of different colors, right? So that everybody can engage. Because historically, if you open a PE cupboard, everything is red and blue. Right? That's not gender neutral. Right? So we see that girls might not get to develop their full potential of skill, foundational skills. Boys might get pushed, coerced into playing a sport they don't like, they don't want to do. Okay? Don't know if this is going to work. Let's see if this will work. Oh yeah, hang on, let me go back here. Okay, so think about your immediate response to the photo that comes up, right? Is it feminine or masculine?
Feminine.
Yeah, right. So, even though I doubt if any of you could jump that high and lift your leg up like that, we still consider this feminine. And what's the immediate assumption about these individuals' sexuality if they're taking part in ballet? What do we judge him to be? So how many cases where athletes go against the stereotype can you think of? I know recently there was a woman that was kicking for an American football team. That was causing all kinds of problems because where was she going to get changed and
I don't have, like, my old school, we had a girl kicker.
Yay! Excellent!
Like, she never kicked, but she was on the team.
Ah, but they didn't actually play her?
Well, I think she might have kicked, like, one field goal, but, like, yeah, nobody ever talked. She had, like, a whole ESPN, like, 30 for 30 and everything.
God. There was also, a couple of years ago, there was a young, and I can't think of her name, I can see her face, there was a young black girl that threw ridiculous baseball pitch, and her school or whatever won some tournament because she was this phenom of a pitcher. At the age of 10 or 11 or something. She probably doesn't have an arm left by now, but yeah, right? We are very much associate certain roles with whether or not it's a boy or a girl. Right? Not many athletes go against the stereotype. Hopefully, we will see the start of more now. I think that generally the conversation is a little more open these days. So, and perhaps parents are becoming a little more flexible with what is acceptable for their little boy or their little girl to do, I hope, right? That would be my hope, anyway. All right, so we're going to pick up with significant others, which is our first box on the societal role, on Thursday, and we'll look at those significant others and the role that they can play, and we'll probably look at some environments. All right? Questions? Questions? No? Any questions on the next assignment, the Olympic constraints? I believe I have everything, the folder open and all the guidelines and everything open. If you can't find it, give me a yell, let me know. But that assignment is looking at this idea of constraints within, hopefully fun. You can find a fun piece of film. I don't think that one's been handed in already, has it? The Olympic constraints. I can't remember what the deadline for that was. Thanks. Anybody remind me what the deadline for that was?
It was April 19th.
So it's coming up, right? It's not done already.
Oh, yes, it's coming up.
Okay. Anybody got questions about that? Okay. All right, so don't forget tomorrow, no classes. If there's some, I know that anthropology are doing some student presentations. I don't know, I think that's the only one I saw an email about. If there's anything going on with your friends, go support them if they're having to do a presentation. It's a bit nerve-wracking, so go and support them doing that. And have a good day, and I'll see you on Thursday.
Have a good day, Dr. Wolf.